Hi, and welcome to the Journey of Joy podcast.
Thank you, EDJ. Yeah, and thank you again, Amanda, for being with us.
Thank you
Yes,
for
we
having
have,
me.
hi, we have Amanda held Opelt with us today to talk about grief, which is not always the easiest topic. I recently read her book, A Hole in the World, and it really moved me. It was very deep and it reminded me of my own grief journey. Would you like to start us off with some of your journey of grief, Amanda?
Yeah. Yeah. I always tell people that I mean, I didn't know it at the time, but I was such a novice when it comes to grief because I had lived a very privileged childhood, a very trauma-free kind of childhood. My parents were well-adjusted humans. We always had all of our needs provided for. We weren't wealthy, but we were never hungry or in want for the basic necessities, and really didn't have anyone that was very close to me die until I hit my mid 30s. I had some grandparents that passed away, but how it feels like, that they had lived to an old age and their time had kind of come and we were able to celebrate their lives, and it felt like death in the right order, if that makes sense. But in my mid 20 or mid 30s, I kind of went through a series of really devastating losses. One was a grandparent who lived near me, who I was very close to, who died suddenly. We thought had a lot more time left. She died very suddenly while I was on a work trip and was stuck in Congo and couldn't get back for her funeral. Then I walked through a season of infertility, which eventually resulted in 3 pregnancy losses that were very, very devastating. And then probably, like the atom bomb that went off in my life was the very sudden death of my only sibling, my older sister, Rachel. And that just kind of, we all have these before and after moments in our lives where we can remember who we were and what life was like before the big catastrophic event. Her death was that big catastrophic event for me. And so when in the aftermath of those losses, I found that I was pretty ill equipped to kind of integrate the pain into my daily life, to know how to manage it and confront it and make space for it. And that's really what began kind of my interest, I guess, in studying grief rituals from the past. But that's a little bit about my own experience of loss.
Thank you for sharing that. We're also going to share about our journeys with grief. So for me, if you can't tell from my accent, I grew up in Australia. And when I was 24, my mum was diagnosed with colon cancer. And by the time I was 28, she passed away, and she had me at 20. So she was 48 when she passed away. And it was a really, really interesting journey. And I don't mean that like it's not all positive, obviously. But some of it actually it felt very redeemed by God, just going on this journey with her of, because I had recently moved back home, I was able to look after her to a degree. I didn't do everything, but take her to a lot of appointments and spend a lot of time with her. And she started to see a naturopath who talked to her about. He was actually really good at getting her to open up about issues with her own parents, and because she grew up as a pastor's kid and was very much perfectionistic and, just trying to be the perfect Christian for everybody, perfect mum, the perfect daughter, everything. So she was able to talk about that and to kind of delve into her own feelings of failure and just resentment and all kinds of things. And she was able to talk about that with me as well and say she might have projected some of that onto her relationship with me as a child, because I also grew up feeling like I needed to be the perfect Christian. And yeah, I did feel like we were both suppressing a lot of what we felt and just trying to put on a Christian happy clappy Happy clappy face. So we were able to talk about that, and she also came to be involved in a new church while she was sick, and she met a pastor who taught a very wonderful grace message about how God always loves and forgives, which is something that you hear, obviously, in church, that God is loving and forgiving. But there's a lot of push towards being that perfect, well-behaved person. So you don't always understand, like, am I really forgiven? Am I really going to heaven? Am I really saved? All that kind of stuff. It kind of gets a bit lost in the murky waters of legalism. And I think for both of us, we went through a journey of discovering that God really does forgive and love and accept us the way we are, and that we are not about to lose our salvation at the drop of a hat.
Right.
Yeah. So coming to that kind of revelation right towards the end of her life was a really powerful thing for her. And then for me, I not long after she passed away, I changed churches and went to the one that she had moved to. And I was discussing with the pastor about how I just couldn't fathom hell anymore, because I was like, it doesn't make sense. Like, if God really loves us and forgives us and died on the cross to save us, surely he can save the whole world. So my pastor ended up doing some research into evangelical universalism, which is, there's a book called The Evangelical Universalist by Robin Parry, and he looked into that, and he deconstructed and became a universalist Christian. And so I went on that journey and felt like there's just no way to know what would have happened if Mum had never gotten sick.
Yeah.
And like having that transformative experience of deconstructing when she passed away, and like a massive deconstruction.
Yeah.
All of my friends changed, like the whole, everything changed for me. Yeah, it's really difficult to separate that and say, well, it still could have happened if she had lived. And it's not me saying I'm glad she died or I wanted her to die, but it's this strange conundrum of something amazing happened out of her death for me. And I say that knowing that it's not the same, like for my siblings like one of my brothers, he was married with 3 children by the time that my mum passed away. He was only 26. And his mother-in-law had already passed away. So my nieces and nephews had no grandmothers. And that was devastating for my brother and my sister-in-law, just to be raising children knowing that they have no grandmothers to look after them, to dote on them. Yeah, it's really tough. So I want to be like honest and say that I know that grief is different for everybody, and it can be absolutely traumatizing. And it can also be really transformative. And just hold space for both of those things.
Yeah.
Joy?
Yeah, I appreciate hearing both of your stories. I'm going to bring the mic a little bit closer, thinking that, I don't know, it might do something different. I'm just hearing what you said, Rachel. I'm sorry, Amanda, about your sister Rachel, and having that be the thing that really kind of put you into this realm of, this is what grief is, or this is what grief feels like, or I can identify with those who are grieving. And the story with your mom, I think people automatically think that when a parent dies, you're automatically in that moment of grief. But for some listeners, they don't know their parents like that, or they don't have that relationship to kind of feel that that instant connection of like, oh wow. I think for me, I was in that place, and this is really for listeners to know how we each are coming to this conversation, to know about us. I think for me, I was in that place of I didn't grow up super close with my parents. They were what I considered parents. Like, they told us what to do and we did it. And if we didn't, we got whoopings, which, you know, for some, I don't know if everyone knows what a whooping is, a spanking, like you got popped on your bottom, or your hand or your leg, or like whatever it was. Yeah. But I think what really strikes me is that there was a point in my there's 7 kids. There was a point in my formative years in which my older sister, she grew up when my parents were younger. And so she's in a different generation of my parents. So when I grew up, my parents were more grown. They were 19 and 20 when they started their family. And it didn't start with the intentions of, anyway, I don't want to tell her story, but she had very different parents is what she said. And so the way that I remember her telling in my formative years is how angry she was at my parents for the way that she had grown up. And so I began to take on like the attributes of like, oh, I should be angry at my parents. But before then I had no memory of being angry at them for any parental, like I never thought about it. It was not something that I had in my mind. And so I grew up in these two worlds of like, oh, she is right. Like, why are things like this in the home? Like, why is it so messy? Or like, why do we have all these, or why don't we have enough money? Or like, you know, and began to like put this, I would say kind of like a negative judgment on like how my parents were making choices or living their life. And whereas before, like I said, I never really judged them in that way. I never really thought about it. I just did what was in front of me and just kind of, I don't even know. I don't even know how I thought. Maybe I was indifferent. I'm not sure, which could be a numb of emotions, like not even knowing how I felt. So by the point that my dad, as an adult, I was 33 and my dad was in the hospital and he did pass away. By that point, I had toggled between, I need to get right emotionally with my parents. Like as an adult, just trying to bring my own healing and the type of relationships that I wanted in my life with men or women, with like whether it's romantic or just like being in community. Like it wasn't there. I know some people are like, oh, you got to heal your relationship with your dad if you want to have a really good relationship. Heal your relationship with your mom if you want to have a really good relationship with women, or, you know, so I was in that space of like, I just need to heal, like whatever this is, like with my siblings, with my parents. So I was already in that space. And the point where my dad passed away, I was in that journey of healing. And I could not believe that he would actually die in the midst of me trying to get right. Like I could not understand that he was gone. Like that was not, and like even the moment that, so he was in the hospital and the doctor nicked his heart. And so that was like an accident. So it was, and I was a medical power of attorney. And so I was there from the very beginning. And I remember when I got the phone call from the actual doctor saying, hey, I need you to come to the hospital because we need to talk to you. Something happened. And after I learned like what happened, I remember sitting in the waiting room and bawling and like being like, God, this is not how he's going to go. Like he cannot die. Like this is not like, is this really like, no, this can't be the moment. Like in that moment, the tears and like what I was emoting was like, God, this is not how this is going to happen. Like, are you kidding me? Like, this is it. Like, this is the moment. I was so unprepared, so in shock. I mean, of many things. It was like, no, like I'm doing, like, I'm living my life in the way that we're taught as adults to like get the healing and to move forward. And like, no, this can't be the moment. This can't be. And so after it took 3 months for the moment to actually happen. And it took exactly 3 months. Like he was in the hospital June 9th. I mean, he was in the hospital March 9th and he died June 9th. And on that morning, when I witnessed him taking his last breath, my reaction was raising my hands and saying hallelujah, because I had 3 months to go through a journey with God, with my dad, of understanding what death and dying be like, and walking someone through that, and walking myself through the possibility of him passing, but really holding on to God's truth. I know he's going to walk out of the hospital. Like that's what I believe, is that he's going to come through this, because we always come through. And so the grief that I felt when my dad passed wasn't just losing him, but it was also losing all the dreams that I attached, like my healing journey. My husband will never meet him. My children will never meet him. Like it was all of these things that I was grieving and that I lost at the same time. And it was that journey that I'm still on. And I don't feel like I really have grieved, because in my life in particular, it was one critical event after the other. Like he passed away, and then my brother was hospitalized, and then my mom had surgery, like brain surgery, and it was like all of these things that and then she was homeless like for a while, and my brother, like they didn't have it was like just one critical event after the other. But like I said, this moment of grief I still carried, and it still, like, it still happens. And I don't know if I was telling you or if I was telling somebody else. It's like, I don't feel like I really grieved my dad's death. Like, I don't feel like I really have had space without having to think about all the things that I need to get done, to really pause and be like, he's gone. He's not here at this moment with me. Like, he won't ever be here in these moments with me. And like I said, I wasn't super, like, I don't think that I wouldn't characterize saying that I grew up super close with my dad, but he had such a profound impact on me in ways that I never understood until I became an adult. And especially when he passed, I just saw him everywhere in me. So thank you both for listening, and for the listeners for listening. But again, this conversation is so important to me, because I just feel like so many of us stay in a state. Maybe I can't speak for other people, but I can speak for myself. I stay in a state of grieving, of so many things that I'm grieving, and it just kind of just lumps together. So I'm really appreciative to be able to have space to even talk about not having space.
One of the things I loved about your book was that just actually helping us to understand that grief is really a lifelong process. When you lose someone, they're gone for the rest of your life. So there's sometimes no end to that grief. It changes, but it's always there. Like when I think of my mom, I'm thinking about her not being able to meet my husband, meet my kids, just like you said, same experience, and that sadness of them not interacting together. It's hard.
And that a similar experience. Like I had my second child maybe 2 years after she had died, 2.5 years, and she we'll never know her. There's one very major member of my family that my sister will never know. And that's the list of losses. I mean, I think when we think of death and we think of grief, we think, well, that person's gone. So that's kind of the ground zero, the critical incident, that occurs is their death. But there are all these other critical incidents that follow, a wedding that they aren't able to attend, a birth that they don't know about, maybe your own, a health crisis of your own that they're not able to help care for you in, and you relive that loss again and again and again as those events occur in your life. So it's not a singular incident. I think that was one of my biggest misconceptions, is that it was a singular incident. This is the worst it'll ever be, and we will slowly recover from there. And there is some sense that it becomes normalized, but you you have these other major, like the aftershocks of a major earthquake in some ways,
Yeah.
or sometimes as damaging as the actual earthquake itself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you talk about bees.
I heard you
I
have bees.
Yeah, well, okay, from one beekeeper to another, I'm curious as to if you have lost your bees. So this is my first season of it, and I was telling I was telling Les that I feel kind of embarrassed because I don't have any bees anymore. Like I have, that's an extreme exaggeration. There are a few bees that are coming in and out of one of the boxes that I have. I have three hives.
Okay.
I had 3 hives. I have one. Anyway, I had 3 hives. One I caught as a swarm, which I
Okay.
was
Oh, good
really
for you.
excited. Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
the swarm that is still, it's a small remnant because the
Yeah.
swarm swarmed again, like
Yeah.
within a couple of
Yeah.
days of getting it. But anyway, um, uh, yeah. So I was telling EDJ um, about the loss of my hives, and like there actually is a bit of shame by it. And I'm also very curious because the shame, I think death of a human can carry some shame depending on who
Yeah.
it is and how they passed away. And I think
100%.
that's an important element to kind of hold together as well. I
Mm-hmm.
can't say that that's true of my dad and my experience with my dad, other than the fact that I was seen as someone who was so religious that
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I have to defend. But no, I was also aware of my emotions. Like I
Mm-hmm.
believed he would be healed, but I also was aware it would have taken a miracle. Like I
Yeah.
wasn't just dumb in that. So I feel like my experience with the bees, in light of how you wrote about the connection to grief, can
Mm-hmm.
really be helpful as
Yeah.
a metaphor to how people can come in and out of grief or hold grief or experience grief. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you can share a little bit more about that with the
Yeah. Well, if it helps with your shame at all, I want you to know that we also lost our bees this year. And so my husband's been a beekeeper for, gosh, he's been doing it maybe 7 years, 8 years, and
listeners.
has had very successful hives. And this year he did all the same things, thought he winterized the hives well, treated them for mites, all the things. And when we looked in the hives at the beginning of the summer, it was actually just a horrific sight. A lot of dead bees and
Wow.
um, hardly any honey left. We were able to extract a little bit, but there were no bees left. And he still doesn't really know what happened. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like we had a couple of really rough cold snaps after some warm snaps. So, there could have been some kind of irregularity there. There was a weak queen. We also had a swarm earlier in the year. So we wondered if there could be a weak queen scenario. But there was 2 hives and they were both gone. So I understand. Yeah. I mean, there is a sense, and it's very real comparison to losing someone you love, because, my husband went through, I remember him coming in the door and his head hung low and he's like, I have really bad news. And I was like, what? He's like, well, the bees are dead. They all died. And he just immediately starts saying, well, I did this and I did this and I did this. Like, I don't know what happened. And it's at some point, it's like, it is nature. There are things out of your control. You couldn't control that, on Christmas Day, it got below 0 after it had been in the 50s the few days before. Like, you couldn't control that. Like, you
Yeah.
can't control all the mites. The bees, in many ways, are their own colony, and you're just a steward of it, and you do your best to steward it. But there is that shame, and I totally relate to the shame of death. I think I always tell people that there are many emotions that follow in the aftermath of someone's death: the anger, denial, profound sorrow, all those things. But the emotion that I feel most confused about is the emotion of embarrassment. Like, I was embarrassed that it happened to me, not embarrassed of my feelings, embarrassed that it had happened. Like, I should have seen it coming. So I look at pictures of myself from the months just before she died, and I was happy. I see pictures of me smiling and I think, you're an idiot. What were you thinking? Like, you should have been preparing. You should have known this was coming. It's this feeling of having been caught off guard. And why wasn't I on guard? which is like, how could I have possibly known? There was no indication that she was going to get the flu and have this horrific response to a bad case of the flu. There was no reason I should have been wary, but there was a sense of what you should have been more wary. You should have been more vigilant. And so I understand the shame of, and then, and also just the shame. Yes, there is some shame that follows in the resulting emotions of like, okay, well, why am I just tired all the time? Why am I cognitively so, I'm just lacking my cognitive abilities that I used to have. And, you feel ashamed by that. And then I think you also feel ashamed a little bit about the way the relationship ended, because when it's a sudden death, that relationship, it gets frozen in time wherever it was. And so you think, well, I should have talked to her more on the phone, or I should have made more time for our relationships. We should have traveled together more, all of those things. And so I think those types of feelings as well can cause a lot of shame, because you think I should have done more. I should have done better. I should have, we were in a very good place relationally. We got along. Weren't holding any grudges. But there are things I wish that I had shared with her that I thought, well, I'll share that with her later. We'll talk about that later. We'll deal with that later. We'll get together more later when we're less busy. And I'm angry at myself for not making more time for her. So that shame when you lose someone is very, very real.
Yeah.
And the control that I think is behind I should have done, or the regrets.
Yeah.
I do remember right after my dad passed away, I had been 2 years out of public health school. And one of the things that I learned is that within like 5 years of a long marriage, the other partner will pass away. So I was like really watching my mom and like, hey, mom, let's go do this. Or like, because I didn't want to have any of those regrets, but it literally was killing me to try to do all the list of things. And I'm like, oh, I got to do this because if she passes, I don't want to have, I don't want to wish I didn't,
Yeah.
And like, so being able to understand, as you said, like we couldn't have possibly known. And leave it at that. And the loss of control, the grieving, the loss of control that means that we don't have.
Yeah.
And yeah. For me, that's hard.
Yeah, it is.
Hard.
We have a pretty, this illusion of control is pretty prominent in our society, because you are seeing people live longer and longer, and we are able to control our outcomes in some ways more than any other culture in the history of time. You know what I mean? Like we just have access to more resources and medical care, and you can kind of look at someone, you can find cancer in someone's body. You can know the cause of death. So we have this sense of death is this aberration that we can control. But we can't. We still can't, as much as we know about it, as much control as we have, and advances as we have in medical technology. We are all still mortal and all still vulnerable and susceptible to death. And so are the people we love. And that's hard to wrap our brains around.
And our hearts around. I mean, you might be thinking in the same way, but being able to be like, like, I'm choosing ice cream over being with my mom in this moment because I want to hang out with my friends, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And like, if she passes, I'm going to not regret not spending time with her, but cherish the fact that I also wanted to create a life that had multiple people that I loved.
Yeah, that's right.
So it wasn't just about the ice cream. It was about the building of love with other people.
Yeah, that's right.
So being able to retrain and reframe like how we look at the past and even how we live the present. Because like I said, I overworked myself. Like I overdid it with being with my mom, because I was like, oh no, what if I don't want that regret? So I would do all of these over the top things. And I'm sure she enjoyed it. She got used to it. But it was exhausting for me. It was really exhausting. live in that space of, I don't want to have, I don't want to regret.
Yeah. And I think that's another thing people don't often tell you about grief is that, like, you're not only losing someone you love, you're watching all the other people you love most in the world go through the worst experience of their life. And so some people think, well, you're dealing with your grief. And it's like, yes, but I'm also dealing with my mother's grief, my father's grief, my brother-in-law. Like, you're trying to also help carry in many ways the grief of the other people you love, just like you, Joy, were carrying the grief of your mother and trying to create this healthy space for her to grieve and process. Well, what does that do to your own grief? It marginalizes it. It kind of makes it invisible in some ways to you. And so that's one thing I have found is that just showing up for my family can happen. It's got to happen in a way that doesn't mean I don't show up for my own grief. And it is not selfish, and it's not wrong for me to make space for my own grief. And, even if I feel like, oh, I need to prioritize other people, it's like, well, you're not going to be able to really show up for people in any meaningful way if you don't make time for your own grief.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk in your book about keening. Could you give us a quick rundown on what keening is?
Yeah. So Irish keening was a practice in old Ireland that emerged many centuries ago and has died out by the mid 20th century. But it's this practice of wailing or screaming aloud at wakes and funerals. And what the communities would do is that there would be women in the communities that often served as midwives, but they would also be the lead wailers or the lead keeners in these communities. The Bon Quinta is the name of the lead keener, these women who knew these liminal spaces between life and death, and they brought people into the world and they escorted them out. And so as people would gather at the wakes of someone who died, wakes, we remember, as before, big medical facilities, wakes and funerals would take place in people's homes, and they would often be all night. So it was traditional to stay up all night with the body, sometimes for several days. And so everyone in the community would come, and these wakes would Ireland is kind of known for its raucous, rowdy wakes. There would sometimes be games and storytelling. There were lots of food, lots of drinking. But the wake would kind of culminate around midnight with the communal wailing. And so you can imagine all the neighbors and family crowded into these small homes. And the Bon Quinta, the lead keener, this probably an old woman, comes in, and everyone gets quiet, and suddenly she starts kind of moaning. And then she'll start singing maybe, and then she'll start wailing and crying. And they would sing songs that were improvised. So they were composed in the moment. So maybe they would say, sing tributes to the person who had died. None of these are recorded because they weren't meant to be repeated. They were composed in the moment for the one person. And then, so the song would mix with wailing, and eventually everyone would join in. And then the idea was that, so you have this whole room of people just screaming and wailing and crying. And the idea was that you would also wail for the loved ones you had lost. It wasn't just wailing for the person who had died. You would wail for everyone that you had lost and that you were still thinking of. So it's this communal lament, and this would continue for hours sometimes. And so it's almost this permission to fall apart. I think if we were to do that at a modern day funeral, we would be judged as being unhinged, right? But for the old Irish, the ancient Irish, they would say, it's not healthy not to do this. It's not healthy not to cry. Wailing is still practiced in many cultures. It's still practiced in I know friends who've lived in Haiti, Liberia say that it's practiced there. It's practiced in the Middle East, other places. And so it's not unique to Ireland, but this very specific way of doing it, keening, is unique to Ireland.
Yeah. I know that leading up to my mum's passing, there were many times that I cried. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I would just wake up and cry. And other times driving in my car, I'd pull over and cry. And she was sick for 4 years, and we were told she had 2 years to live. So she doubled that, which is pretty amazing. And she was the Pentecostal, I'm gonna live through this. God's gonna heal me. So she wasn't talking about her death until January 2011. She passed away in May. So in January, she like came to us, her kids, and said, I'm going to die. And we were all, it was just a profound experience where we all cried and hugged her, and we all accepted the fact that she was going to go because she had said, this is enough. And I can't even, it's hard to give words to that kind of experience. But yeah, I'm grateful for that. I think that we all need to be able to cry. I really do. And to be able to grieve deeply.
Yeah.
And I think wailing and songs, it's a good way of being able to allow your soul to emote. I think crying totally is an apt emotion, and to be able to tell. And you're very musical, so I mean, you're
so's Amanda.
There is a poem that I wrote after my dad passed away, and it was only because I was asked to do some writing for a performance, and it was just something that came out. And one of the, you all are familiar, like "Come by here, dear Lord, come by here." Singing that song and singing it with different words, like I rewrote the lyrics a little bit, but singing it in a particular way allowed me to cry when I couldn't physically cry. And to me, that it's the importance of music, which we may get into a little bit later, but it's also like that wailing. It's like, like the groans, the moans, the like the come by here, dear Lord, come by here. Like it's just like that.
Yeah.
And it releases. It allows me to be able to release in a way, even if the tears won't come.
Yes. Yeah. It's a physical experience. I think we tend to think of grief as a mental and emotional experience, but we are whole beings. You know, there's a false dualism that says that my heart and my head exist separate from my body. Your body grieves. Anybody that's really, really grieved knows that you experience whether it's a headache, stomach aches, weariness of body, backache, but you hold grief in your body. And so in some ways you're able to expel grief when you wail, and you say you're able to at least kind of name it and just show that it's an embodied experience when you wail, you know?
I think it's also important to express anger. And I was thinking back to when your sister Rachel died. So she had a daughter that was born in May a year before she died, and I had a daughter who was born in May that same month that her daughter was born. And I remember thinking, how could you let this happen, God? Like, I was so angry because I've read every single one of your sister's books. I thought she was amazing. And I just felt like if it was me, I would be so angry at you, God. How dare you take me away from my daughter? And I had so much anger around that. Thinking, I just couldn't even fathom how much anger there would be for you or for your parents or everyone involved, like, to lose Rachel at such a young mothering age. So difficult. And I would really like to just spend a moment for anyone out there who is really angry around the death of a loved one, to just sit and process that for a minute, and to allow yourself to feel your own anger, because I think we all do experience anger around death.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to ask about was your own deconstruction journey that might have related to your sister's passing and other people in your life that passed away.
Yeah.
Did that start a deconstruction journey for you?
You know, I think that, you know, like many people, let's see, how old was I when Rachel died? I was 35. And so, you know, like many people who grew up with faith, I had already been doing some deconstruction of, like, you know, what I believed and what I thought was true. And I think what Rachel's death really did was deconstruct, maybe not so much theologically, because some of that had already happened, but it really began to deconstruct the language we use around the experience of faith. So, like, language of, you know, everything happens for a reason, or language of, like, a peace that passes understanding. You know, these very, um, some of these euphemisms, some of the platitudes, the palliative words that we use around the experience of faith, of life, of being human, and beginning to wonder if those were maybe misleading in some ways. So I went back to the Bible, kind of read through the Bible actually shortly after she died, with the perspective of a griever. And all of a sudden, all these, like, really horrific stories in the Old Testament that I used to think were, like, I didn't even know what box to put them in, kind of made more sense to me. There's, like, these victims, many women, marginalized, oppressed women, their stories were told and seen. And then I started to see the anger of God. You know, you just mentioned anger. Do we have permission to be angry? God is a very emotive God. You know, I think we talk about God, again, this is where that language deconstruction comes from. We talk about God as this, like, kind of very controlled force, this sovereign, kingly, noble, holy entity, very male entity. You know, that's kind of how we talk about God. But we see passages in Jeremiah where God is ennobling the wailing women, calling the wailing women, even almost comparing himself to a wailing woman, comparing himself to a woman in labor. We see God being angry. We see God being grieved. We see God regretting making humankind. I mean, all kinds of emotions. And particularly in the life of Jesus, we see a very emotive, incarnate God, a God who some people say had a near panic attack in the Garden of Eden. He was so in dread of the prospect of the cross. And so I think what I deconstructed more was kind of this very singular view I had of God as this sovereign, controlled, holy entity that couldn't be bothered by my own emotions. I met a God maybe that had that could enter my sorrow with me. So it was a deconstruction that was healing in many ways. There are other aspects of the deconstruction that followed that were harder, you know, maybe my feelings about heaven, or the specificity of, like, what is heaven? Like, what's Rachel doing right now? And kind of maybe the more you look in scripture for specifics about what heaven's going to be like, the less you find. It's not very clear. And that was upsetting to me. I wanted to know she was residing in the mansions of glory and what that was going to look like and what our reunion would look like. And it's not actually all that clear in scripture, you know? And so just kind of coming to a place in where it's like, I don't even know, is heaven even real? Is there an afterlife? You know, some of those questions that I had, and, you know, not sure those have even been fully resolved. But you know, so yeah, in many ways it was both a healing reimagining of God and also kind of a frightening one, and one that's still very much in progress and in process.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely relate to that. Just the questions around what does the afterlife look like? And it's still unanswered, still trying to figure all that out.
Yeah. And there is a sense in which I kind of accept the risk. Like faith is in many ways, Rachel used to always say that faith is risk in some ways. You're putting your trust in something you can't see. And I think as long as I'm still, for however long I still feel like I want to call myself a Christian, whatever that is, I am putting my faith in the hope of resurrection. It is a hope. It is faith. It is a risk because I could be wrong about it. But I'm still putting, I think, some well-founded trust in it. And that's exactly what faith is. It's just reading, who hopes in for what they've already seen. That's not the point of hope. The point is that you don't know and that you don't see. But I will say that I've become less and less certain of the specifics of what that's going to look like.
Yeah, I remember my brother at the hospital the day that my dad passed said, because my whole family knew that I believed that he would walk out of the hospital. And he and then a really good family friend said to me, well, he did walk out of the hospital. He's walking out in all of us. And I'm like, you know what? That's very poetic, but he's not. Like, I am not my dad. Like that is not like in one sense, it's very beautiful to hold on to like say, okay, I have a part of him. Like literally, I do have a part of him. I'm in the DNA. Like I do have a part of him. But then in another sense, it's like, you know what I meant? Like that vision wasn't like a metaphor. Or maybe it could, but I'm saying the way that I believed it and the way that I talked about it was not in a metaphorical sense of like, we're going to have a flower bloom and like, this is him walking. Like it wasn't.
Yeah, I get that frustration with the metaphors were they grated against me early on in my grief journey. Like this whole idea of, well, her memory will live on. I was like, she's dead. Like she is dead. She is gone. She no longer lives. Like, well, she lives on in you. She does not. She is dead.
Yeah.
Like there was something in me that needed for people to say what had happened, and not soften it. And I think that's partly why, and everybody makes different choices about what they call a service, a funeral service, but we were very adamant to not call it a celebration of life. We called it a funeral because it was like, we needed to say she had died. And again, everybody kind of has to make their own choice of what feels right to them. So I don't judge others, but we needed to say, we are grieving. This is a funeral. She's dead. And that feels, for some reason, the metaphors feel a little more helpful to me now, almost 5 years down the road, where it's like, okay, well, there is this sense in that what she planted in me, the goodness and the wisdom will grow. And in some ways, there's a legacy that lives on. But it has taken me 5 years to kind of step into metaphor world, if that makes sense. And we immediately jump into it, I think, when someone dies. But it's like, the cognitive dissonance of it for me was too hard. It was like, no. Like her body is no longer animated. She is dead. Like she's in the ground. She's dead. She's gone. And something about me needed to name that very specifically.
I'm glad you said that, Amanda. EDJ knows the story about me, but I started a nonprofit, and it was because my sister had looked at me in the time after my dad passed away and was like, Joy, take your tears and let them water the seeds that he planted in all of us. Again, like another beautiful way of understanding death and legacy.
Yeah.
And as you said, having those, whether it was the metaphors or however people want to explain it, it was very helpful for me. Like I said, I started a nonprofit in light of what she said. Like maybe I would have done it anyway, but not with the same intention and meaning of like, let me like craft this in this particular way.
Yeah.
So I think what that brings light to is the timing, and that we each decide what will serve us and what doesn't. And other people to be aware that what I say may or may not be helpful for this person.
That's right.
In this moment in time. And the complexity of how we understand grief, how we talk about grief. And really, that's not about grief. It's really about death and how we understand this moment has stopped. This moment that I had with this person has stopped at this moment, or whatever
Yeah.
it may be. So
Yeah. And I think, again, that's why this is so tricky. It's like when it's like, I don't believe in giving people manuals of what to say when someone dies, because the experience is so different for everyone. Like, I've had miscarriages. I know other women that have had miscarriages, and the experience is totally different. Like, no, that, or even losing a parent versus losing a parent you had a good relationship with versus losing a parent that you didn't have a good relationship with, versus, it's not that one is easier or than the other. It's just different. Losing a sibling versus like death is so, it's a universal experience, but each one is its own thing, its own unique experience. That metaphor we've used a lot about COVID. It's like we're all in the same water, but we're in different boats, kind of, like some of us are in rowboats and others of us are in luxury yachts and others of us are like clinging on to a piece of driftwood, like, and I think that kind of grief can be like that too. So it's like something that might be helpful to say to one person may not be helpful to say to another. And that's why just listening and paying attention to the person who's grieving is so necessary, rather than coming in with answers, even if those answers were helpful to you,
I think one of the things I wanted when my mum passed away was just more time, because it was like, a couple of weeks afterwards, people expect you to be back to normal.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you don't understand anything about grief if you think I'm the same person, let alone back to, like, you want me to suddenly be happy or be whatever. Like it was real. That was really a feeling of disconnect that was baffling. Like, just give me some time and space to process that it really is over now, because it's different to go through a journey of them being sick for 4 years and then they're actually gone. Two very different things.
Yes.
Yeah. I actually wrote a song I wrote it when I found out that Mum was sick, and I played it at her funeral. I played the piano and my sister was singing. One of my brothers played the guitar and the other one played the drums.
Wow.
Yeah, we put it together, and it was that was like a spiritual experience, being able to play that song at the funeral. And like, I still look at that and go, I think that was the most emotional performance of my entire life.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, I wasn't crying, but it was just like, I bashed that piano and my fingers were like numb afterwards. I had aching arms. My whole body was like, I'm just like this, and singing and playing, and I probably looked ridiculous. And but my whole body went into that musical outpouring of my mum's life. That was really significant for me. I was wondering if you had written any songs around grief yourself.
Yeah, I ended up actually writing 6 songs to kind of go, in some ways, accompany the book I wrote about grief. But I remember there was one song that I wrote very shortly after she died, 2 that I wrote shortly after she died, that were just they were all about making space for grief. You know what I mean? And I think that there's something about the creative experience and the experience of writing music or playing music that is particularly cathartic because it involves your body, and everything else that you're being given, to comfort you, whether that's sympathy cards or people, trying to offer words of condolence, that kind of goes to here and here, but you're to do something with your body. And that's why I wrote a whole chapter on funeral foods and casseroles, is because I think like that actual delivery of food and the eating of food is a physical experience of grief and processing grief that I think is so important. But so in many ways is the wailing, the singing, the musical element can be so cathartic,
Yeah,
and how
absolutely.
special that you got to do that with all your siblings. That's really, really beautiful.
It was really special.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, do you have any final words to leave the listeners with regarding bees or grief or music or keening or any of the things that we've talked about or any new insights that you may have?
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate you all sharing your stories so vulnerably and for being open to this conversation, open to the idea that some of the aftermath of grief is not very tidy. And I love, Joy, you did this mention of shame. It's like, I feel shame for my deconstruction. EDJ had a significant deconstruction after your loss. And I feel shame about my deconstruction. I feel shame about my anger. And I think it's just the most important gift we can give people when they're grieving is a sense of permission. And just to understand that I think patience is your greatest ally when you're grieving. The way you feel today is not how you will feel forever. Similarly to our bees, the bees will be back. We will get new bees and there will be honey in the hives for us someday. You know what I mean? Today does not define forever. It doesn't define the success of my husband as an apiarist. But it's, there are going to be seasons that are hard. There are going to be seasons where the bees are not prolific and they even die, but are we a steward? Can we be the steward of our hives? And are we a steward of our lives? That is a song, EDJ. You're welcome to. There's some rhyming there, I'm sure, if you want to pick that up. But I'm saying, like, we steward our lives over a period of seasons and changes. And it's okay if one season is a season of anger, a season of doubt, a season even of unbelief. That's okay. Give yourself time. The way that you're experiencing your loss in year 1 is not the same as it's going to be in year 5 or year 10 or year 20. And it's all about being patient with yourself and learning to integrate your loss and what you've learned. And I think you're absolutely right, EDJ, that like there are beautiful things that can come in the aftermath. And it doesn't mean that then you categorize the loss as good. Just because good things followed and good things happened as a result of her death doesn't mean that you are saying that her death was good. Her death will always be unequivocally bad. Like it is bad. It is awful. It is terrible. I feel the same way about my sister's death. It will never be anything but awful and terrible. And and there have been some good things that have come as a result of her death. And I can say that both are true, that they run parallel. And that's okay. So I think your journeys and sharing what you've shared. The best thing about writing a book about grief is that I get to talk to other people about their grief journey, and I learn more and more about grief, and I glean more wisdom every time I have these conversations. So thank you to both of you for adding to that conversation and